Good morning, everybody. Happy last day of session. All right, welcome to the organizational meeting of the Emergency Committee on the Impacts of Federal Workforce and Funding Reductions. I am David Bulova. I represent the 11th District in the House of Delegates, and very honored to have been appointed by Speaker Scott to serve as chair of the committee. Also pleased to be here with my colleague, Delegate Rob Bloxham, who is my vice chair. I am very grateful to all of my colleagues for being here on a Saturday morning. I think, as you all know, the work of the General Assembly never really ends, whether that's going into weekends or transitioning from regular session to the work that we do all year round. But I think also, as everybody is aware, things are moving rather quickly at the federal level, and so we did not want to lose this opportunity while we were still down here in Richmond to be able to get together and do the very important work of this committee. Before we get started, Clerk, if you can call attendance.
Chair Bulova.
Here.
Delegate Bloxham.
Here.
Simon.
Here.
Watts.
Here.
Feggins.
Here.
Anthony.
Here.
Cole.
Here.
Thomas.
Here.
Tata.
Here.
Kent.
Here.
Wilt.
Here.
Campbell.
Here.
A quorum is present, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Madam Clerk. Just to start off, I think many of you know who is sitting up here at the dais, but one of the strengths of the way that we have elections in Virginia is that we do have a wide diversity of perspectives and backgrounds of our members that really helps to make the conversation much more rich. And so if I could get each of the members to introduce themselves, tell us where you represent, and also just tell us a little bit about what you do outside of the General Assembly session. So why don't I start down here with Delegate Cole, or Delegate Thomas.
The other Josh, Mr. Chairman.
The other Josh.
Delegate Josh Thomas, representing the 21st District in Prince William County. In my day job, I'm a commercial real estate and banking attorney.
Good morning, everyone. Joshua Cole, representing the 65th House District in the city of Fredericksburg, Southern Stafford County, and Northern Spotsylvania County. And I am a pastor and a full-time student at the University of Mary Washington.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Benita Anthony. I represent the 92nd House District, which covers portions of Norfolk and northern Chesapeake, which we call South Norfolk. And in my day job, I work in higher education, and this is 20 years for me.
Good morning, everybody. Delegate Michael Feggins, representing House District 97 in portions in the city of Virginia Beach. I'm a retired Air Force medical professional, 20 years in, and now I am working in cybersecurity.
Good morning, Delegate Vivian Watts, representing the 14th District, 2/3 inside the Beltway, Annandale. I'm thinking of all the things that I bring to the table. 15 years of a lot of involvement in local taxes as a citizen, working for the Fairfax County Chamber of Commerce, representing the economic interest of Northern Virginia as we grew. My husband spent 40 years as the attorney for the National Park Service, so I do understand what is going on with the economics as far as all of the consultants, and I too worked as a government consultant at one point in my involvement.
Good morning, Marcus Simon. I represent the lucky 13th District, which is in Falls Church in Fairfax County. Again, a little bit, mostly inside, but a little bit of outside the Beltway. Home to quite a number of federal employees, retired federal employees, contractors, and so forth. In my day job, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a real estate attorney, and I have a title company. I'm very involved in the real estate practice, and also a former JAG, so some military connections to the DC area as well.
Good morning, Delegate Bloxham. I represent the 100th District, which is the eastern shore and the northern tip of Virginia Beach. I have 3 small businesses. I'm an auto parts store, then we have a repair shop, and then I also have a clam and oyster aquaculture business. Glad to be here.
Good morning, I'm Ann Farrell Tate. I represent the 99th District, which is in Virginia Beach, northeast part of Virginia Beach, part of Hampton Roads, which is home to the largest naval base in the world, also the Navy SEALs, East Coast SEALs, and my day job, I work for K-Love Christian Radio Network.
Delegate Tony Wilt, represent the 34th House District, City of Harrisonburg, and a portion of Rockingham County. recently retired after 41 years in the ready-mix concrete industry.
Good morning, Hillary Pugh Kent, representing District 67, which includes the Northern Neck and a portion of Caroline. And in my day job, I am a multi-generational beverage distributor there in the Northern Neck.
Good morning, I'm Delegate Campbell. I am in the 36th House District, which is Stanton City, Waynesboro City, a portion of Augusta County, and a portion of Rockbridge. And I've worked for 30 years in the banking industry.
All right, thank you very much. And I represent again the 11th district, so that's the city of Fairfax, parts of central Fairfax County. Also includes the main campus of George Mason University, and I work for an engineering and environmental consulting firm. So I just wanted to say a couple of brief remarks about the work of the committee before we have our presentations today. First of all, I think I can speak on behalf of all of my colleagues up here at the dais that we are very proud of our federal workers and proud of our contractors who call Virginia their home. These are individuals that not only work very hard to deliver essential services to 8.7 million Virginians, they also work very hard to provide services for 335 million Americans. Second, as we prepare to adopt our budget today, I think each of us is very keenly aware that Virginia relies on its partnership with the federal government to provide critical services that Virginians rely on. These include education, it includes housing, it includes healthcare services, it includes transportation, and these are just to name a few of them. And these are things that not only impact our urban and our suburban areas, they also affect our rural areas as well. So for instance, broadband deployment in rural areas, support for our family farms and rural economic development initiatives are all state and federal partnerships. We are here today because federal workforce reduction and cuts in spending not only affect the ability of individual families to support themselves, it's also going to have a ripple effect on our economy and affect our state budget. It is very true that as a Virginia House of Delegates, we do not have direct control over the cuts being implemented or proposed by the administration. However, we do have responsibility for two areas. The first is Article 10, Section 7 of our Constitution, requires us to balance our budget every year. And likewise, we are each and every one of us up here fiercely protective of our AAA bond rating. And so as a result, it's not only prudent to understand the potential impacts of these cuts, but also how they're going to affect our budget and our economy. And so we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to ensure that that economy and that budget is as resilient as possible. And one of my favorite terms is failing to plan is planning to fail. And so we absolutely owe it to our fellow Virginians to plan up front. Secondly, though, and I think most importantly, is that we have a responsibility to help Virginians navigate these challenges. And so again, these are our friends, these are our neighbors, they are constituents, oftentimes they're family members. And they will be turning to us as their elected leaders to do what we can to help. And what I've learned in the 20 years that I've been a member of the Virginia House of Delegates is that our constituents don't really care so much about whether we are locally elected, whether we are federally elected, whether we are state elected. They expect us to be able to do all that we can in order to be able to help them weather the storm. And so we are, after all, a commonwealth. I love telling people the difference between just a state and a commonwealth, and that's because everything that we do is done towards a common good. So to that end, the Speaker has tasked us with the following. First, collecting and analyzing data on the potential scope of workforce and funding cuts, assessing the likely economic and budgetary impacts on Virginia, engaging with stakeholders, including state agencies, businesses, and nonprofits to understand their concerns and gather mitigation strategies, and then finally to provide policy recommendations for the General Assembly to address the challenges posed by federal reductions. And so today's meeting is really the beginning of that process in order to be able to gather that data and make recommendations back to our colleagues as we navigate the challenges ahead. I do want to wrap up my introductory remarks by stressing something that has been repeated by the Speaker a number of times, and this is a bipartisan effort. This is Virginia's economy. It's not a Republican or a Democratic economy. This is Virginia's budget, and these are Virginia families. And each and every one of you up here on this committee were selected by the Speaker because he trusts us to work together. He trusts us to listen. He trusts us to do our homework and to make informed recommendations. Again, I'm proud to be up here with my Vice Chair, Rob Bloxham. We serve on the bipartisan Tri-State Chesapeake Bay Commission together, and so we know firsthand what it means to be able to work together in a bipartisan way in order to deliver results for Virginians. Lastly, I want to thank our DLS and our clerk for all the work that they are about to do. I really appreciate it. And I also want to say thank you very much to our House Appropriations staff. First of all, Ann Oman, the Executive Director, but in particular, Kim McKay and David Reynolds. When I approached them a couple weeks ago about doing this, they actually seemed excited about the prospect. I chalked it up to sleep deprivation, but regardless, I do appreciate them. They are very talented, and they're going to be absolutely fantastic resources as we move ahead with the process. And so with that, we're going to move on to our first agenda item. And so our first presentations are really designed to help us understand the current environment and potential impacts. And so again, things are moving fast at the federal level. We'll get into a lot more detail about these things in future meetings. But we thought that it would be good to kind of set the stage with respect to what do we know, what are we tracking right now. Please, members, as you're listening to the discussion and the presentations, be thinking about what kind of data we need in order to make informed decisions. So that's going to be the final item as we're going to do a round robin. So be thinking about what is it that you would like to know or hear that would help make sure that we make good decisions moving forward. And so we do have three great speakers. Appreciate them coming up. We're down to Richmond on a Saturday. Clark Mercer, the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. Eric Scorsone, the Executive Director of the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service, and Mitch Mellis, the Commissioner of the Virginia Employment Commission. So thank you all for being here. Mr. Mercer, you are up first. The floor is yours.
All right. Okay, you guys hear me? Well, it's nice to be back in Richmond. I was here yesterday. My son graduated from the Senate Page program and was asked if I would stick around and present today. I was here for 12 years working on Capitol Square. Quick bit of background, my family moved to Northern Virginia in the 1930s, both from rural parts of the state. One in the Northern Neck was a waterman who joined the Air Force, ended up at the Pentagon and Fort Myer. And the other side of the family were tobacco farmers from Kentucky, went to work for the Department of Agriculture in the 1930s. So after my service here on Capitol Square, moved back to Alexandria, where I run the Council of Governments now. A little bit about the Council of Governments. We represent and work with local governments in Northern Virginia, the District and suburban Maryland, everything from Loudoun and Prince William up, the District of Columbia and suburban Maryland. So your chairs of Board of Supervisors, your mayors, and you've got legislative and executive branch serving on our board. And we coordinate things that you would hope local governments are working on. So we run 24 different public safety programs for the Capital Region, including the Mutual Aid Agreement, which allows police and first responders to respond across state and jurisdictional boundaries. We run clean water programs for the region. We run the Transportation Planning Board, which has all the transportation plans in the Capital Region. Think Long Bridge, your managed lanes, any transportation project that has federal dollars on it. We run a procurement program for the region, so we buy items that local governments buy, diesel, gas, road salt, bottled water, to save local governments money. We've got about 125 staff, and our offices are headquartered by Union Station and DC. I'll begin by saying, just level setting, and I think the comment that the chair made about just capturing data here, there's a lot of unknowns, and anyone who tells you they know exactly what's going on in DC and how that's going to affect Virginia isn't being truthful. I will tell you kind of the best stats that we know and how we're thinking about effects on the Capital Region and by extension in the capitals in Annapolis and in Richmond. The first, I think, is just understanding the potential impact. You hear a lot of folks comment that there's anywhere between 140 and 160,000 federal jobs located in Virginia. And it's all about how you ask that question. There are between 140 and 190 jobs located in Virginia, but there are a lot more Virginians that work federal jobs The headquarters of those jobs can be in the district, can be in Maryland, can be outside of Virginia. The number is closer, as you see from last year's census, 315,000 federal workers in Virginia that may have headquarters, like I said, at NIH in Maryland or obviously in DC. This chart here just shows you that the level of federal workers in Virginia has been relatively stable going back several presidential administrations. Obviously, the contracted work and consultants, the work has increased over that time, and a lot of that has been contracted out. So there's about 400,000 federal workers in the national capital region. 160,000 plus of those are in Northern Virginia. You've got about 400,000 contracted employees in Virginia and the DMV as well. And then there's a multiplier effect, and economists argue about what that is. But essentially, for every good paying job, it creates some amount of jobs in the service-related industry. Think your baristas, think your dry cleaners, think folks that are running a local gym. It's anywhere from 0.4 to 3 additional jobs are created for every good paying job that you have. And then you see the breakout there on the right, broken down by jurisdictions in Northern Virginia and our COG region, number of the federal workers. And we can certainly break this out for all of Virginia, but some of our census tracts are obviously more impacted than others. These census tracts are largely in Fairfax County, Arlington, and Loudoun County. But you see the one there that the highest is 38% of all the workers are federal employees in that census tract. And a census tract is typically around 4,000 folks. And when you look at the map, obviously in urban areas, the census tracts are geographically smaller. They get bigger and when you go to more rural areas. And this is just a percentage of the workforce in Virginia. So about 10% of our workforce in Virginia are federal employees, and then that breaks it down by metro area. You could think kind of a concentric circle that goes out from DC, and then obviously blips on that radar is the Hampton Roads region, Richmond, and Roanoke. While Northern Virginia is a small geographic portion of Virginia, maybe 5%, it's 42% of the state's GDP. So reduction in force impacts to date. And again, this is one of those where we don't have good, crisp data because for a variety of reasons, folks are getting let go daily, they're getting rehired, lawsuits are being filed, but there's 3 categories of employees that we think about. One, or you hear the probationary employees. And it's important when we talk about probationary employees, that's folks who have been on the job perhaps for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. It's also individuals who have gotten raises. So it's mid-career and seasoned folks. When you get a raise in the federal government, you are then on probation for the first year of your new job. So this is not just brand new folks. Buyouts, you've heard the offer that was made to federal employees at 75,000 individuals accepted. And then once you get past those 2 categories of workers, we're entering into what's called RIFs, formal reductions in force, which take a little bit more time and establish that a need is no longer needed and positions can be eliminated. It's a bit of a more formal process. There's also an EO that has gone out that stipulates for every new hire moving forward, you would need to let go for federal workers. So to date, 295,000 employees. 220,000 of those are probationary, 75,000 buyouts accepted, but this is very fluid and kind of changes by day. Stated goal of the federal recalibrating the federal workforce for the DOGE Commission is 75% reduction in federal workforce. If you run the numbers, then this chart is just federal employees. So it's not your contractors, it's not your multipliers. So this is just federal employees. If they were to reach the 75% reduction, those are the unemployment rates on the right that you would see in those regions. And I would note that at the height of COVID in the DMV region, it was 9.4%. So this would lead to a 9.6% unemployment rate. Additional issues, this is not all of them, and I'm not going to opine on any of these, but just list things that we are certainly thinking about. SNAP and Medicaid are 2 big issues that the Congress and the presidential administration are working through right now. That stat there is from the Capital Area Food Bank, looking at the number of Virginians that receive SNAP benefits. And one of the offsets is to reduce SNAP benefits to offset for the upcoming congressional budget and what that would mean in terms of what folks would receive per household. They are also modeling out the percentage of federal employees that make less than $70,000 per year, which is about 20%, and the number of those individuals who would be food insecure and seek assistance from the food bank, which they are roughly estimating would be an additional 20,000 Virginians. In the defense arena, you have heard Secretary Hegseth articulate that he would like to achieve an 8% reduction every year for the next 5 years in the Defense Department budget, which would be approximately a 40% cut in the defense budget. Obviously, that's going to be something that we'll track. There are important lobbies, bipartisan lobbies nationally and certainly in Virginia, so we'll see where that ends up. Although next week, the first number is 5,400 civilian members of the Pentagon are set to be released. Transportation formula adjustments, this is one that we're really keeping an eye on. There was a memo from the new secretary articulating prioritizing birth rate and marriage rate in terms of where transportation dollars will go. I will say this is just a memo. So, we don't know until there's official policies put into place. I think the Cardinal wrote a good article this past week about how that would affect rural areas of Virginia, Southwest Virginia, projects like the Coalfields Expressway. We really don't know what it will mean to tie transportation dollars to birth rates and marriage rates, only that if you do that, there's some particularly rural parts of the state that would be hit. Environmental initiatives and DEI programs, the president's been very clear that he does not want to continue supporting Green New Deal projects and DEI programs. We've seen in the news what that has, the types of projects that has affected. The federal real estate portfolio. So an interesting statistic, DC has more office space per capita than any metro area in the country. I think folks know that the commercial office space is not doing so well in the DMV and in Northern Virginia. The president has made it clear that he would like to work with GSA to give up federally owned properties and move into lease space, and that is moving pretty aggressively. Kind of how that all pans out, we don't know. Patent and Trade Office is a good example. When their lease was up half a year ago, they gave up 1 million square feet of their lease space in Alexandria. So there could be, at the end of this, an opportunity in the private sector to lease space back to the feds. But GSA is moving aggressively to identify federal properties that they would like to get off of their portfolio. Population growth, immigration. I think you all have seen the numbers. Virginia has grown. When you take out immigration numbers, the growth is stagnant, or in Northern Virginia, we're losing population. Those numbers are driven largely by immigration. I put housing here. We do a lot of work on housing. Housing production has not been what it needs to be in Virginia, particularly in Northern Virginia, to meet demand. Local governments now, though, are kind of thinking about the beginning of COVID, what programs could local governments put up before the state and the feds had programs available to residents. And certainly for the folks losing their positions, rent abatement and eviction moratorium are two things that localities did that they're certainly thinking of putting back in play as we move forward. This is just a quick, there was a meeting 2 days ago of some of the largest trade and business associations in the DC region. And there are industries in the DC region where Virginia is not insulated, but they have some strengths compared to their neighbors in the district and in Maryland. Obviously, defense, cyber, artificial intelligence, healthcare. I know you'll talk quite a bit about data centers, but when you look at growth in the economy and in the tax rolls, that's certainly quite a strength for the Commonwealth. Mentioned Virginia Works, and I see that the secretary here is nationally recognized as a real strength that we have, and something I'll talk about in the next slide as something we need to leverage working with the feds. And then return to work and Metro public transit. I've been in my position for 2 years, and one of the first acts that I did was to work with the 24 CAOs in the DMV 2 years ago to ask the Biden administration to find a better balance in return to office. The federal posture was pretty out of balance when you look at local governments and state governments. So we've been encouraging the administration to find a better balance. The Trump administration has called workers back for 5 days, and you see for Metro, they have 45 months of growth. As a transit system, they recovered more riders last year than any transit system in the country. But when you break down their numbers, you see their bus routes are back to pre-pandemic levels and have been for quite some time. Their night and weekend travel is back to pre-pandemic levels, but it's that weekday traffic that was off the mark from pre-pandemic. Over the last 2 weeks, you see those numbers have increased, which is a good sign for Metro and by extension, the bills that come to Richmond. Partners around the region are bracing for budgetary impacts. This is a quote from a couple weeks ago from the Senate president in Maryland, anticipating that they would need to cut $1.5 billion based on what's happened at the federal level, in addition to what they're already anticipating to cut. And I will mention their session goes on through April, and so we don't know where that will wash out, but they're certainly looking at this. And I think that perhaps one of the future panelists will talk about this, but I know in the district working with the Urban Institute, there's already some modeling going on anticipating 10% cuts, 25 and 50%, 75% cuts, what that does to real income and by extension, the GDP. And that is certainly something I would encourage the Department of Taxation here to be working on with you. How we prepare. So the numbers coming out of the Office of Personnel Management just are not clean and crisp. There's not as much transparency as to who is being laid off or bought out and what their skill sets are. And then accurate updated numbers of the jobs available in Virginia. This meeting 2 days ago included the Board of Trade, it included the Greater Washington Partnership and a number of other business owners, and the point that was made was data that we're using from 2 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago in terms of what jobs are available, we can kind of throw out the window right now. You saw Fairfax County roll out their budget this past week. That includes 200 layoffs, and you see some of our large Fortune 500 companies either freezing or anticipating layoffs. So the Greater Washington Partnership represents the largest employers from Richmond to Baltimore, so think in Richmond, Dominion, CoStar, and Baltimore, Under Armour. And then you've got Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Amazon in the DC area. They're doing a query right now, and that data should be available in the next several weeks. How many jobs do you have available now? What skill sets do we need? And what are you doing to upskill your workers? And I think that just gets back to our own workforce data. When you look at who is being let go and what their skills are and what jobs we have available, through the state Virginia Works site. The most prevalent job that's available is a registered nurse. 80% of those jobs available require a specialized license or their entry-level job. So after registered nurse, the next most available job is an entry-level retail minimum wage position. So I think we need to really come to grips with who is being let go, what skill sets do they have, and then what really is available. That would be my number one recommendation is to work with OPM on getting better line of sight in terms of who is being let go. And you see a couple websites there. Local governments are putting up resources, trying to match workers with jobs. And then I would just finish my comments by saying it would be remiss not to mention this, but having worked on Capitol Square for 10 years. Our state workforce is the best in the business. I'm really happy to see that is an agenda item because so much of our state workforce is funded with and relies on federal dollars. So the same kind of exercise we're doing anticipating cuts, we need to start thinking about different dollars that flow through the state and fund our state workers and anticipate and plan for reductions or how we would prevent reductions in the state workforce. That concludes my remarks. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clark. Does any member of the committee have questions? Delegate Fagans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the questions I have in terms of, as we're looking at the data that you provided us, is there a way to break out the difference between the GS and NAF? And I ask that because we have a lot of non-appropriated fund workers, especially in Virginia Beach, where we have a naval exchange. Do you know, is there able to tell the difference, or are we really looking at GS workers?
I can certainly get back to you and see what kind of granularity we have. I mean, I think the information we have on if you have a federal position and you're civilian or not comes from the census. I don't think it gets too much more granular. Some of the differences in numbers with the federal jobs, one of the big agencies that sometimes is included, sometimes isn't, is Postal Service and seasonal employees. So sometimes if you see a 30 to 50,000 person change in number and wonder why, that's a big reason. But I think that gets to kind of OPM and it gets to Defense Department. So 6,500 civilians next week are going to be let go. And we don't have any line of sight in terms of who those are, if they're GS or what nature of position they have.
All right. Other questions? Delegate Wilt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back on slide 9, you talked about the probationary employees. Can you do a breakout on that? I mean, how many are direct federal employees? How many are contract employees?
Yes, sir. So the probationary employees are all federal employees. So when you're hired at the federal government, your first couple of years, you don't necessarily have the same labor protections as folks who have been in the service for longer. So during the first 2 years, you can be let go, not without cause, but it's easier to let someone go in the first 2 years. Or when you get a raise, you have that probationary period. So those are all federal employees.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Wilt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Later in your presentation, you talked about skill sets. Can you speak to the skill sets of those probationary employees? What level are they coming in at?
Well, it depends, right? Like, I mean, just since I've been here, I was here since yesterday afternoon, and there was a woman here who was let go from a cancer research institute in Maryland and has a background in kind of science and medical. And then this morning at Meriwether, someone that was on a Department of Energy contract. So the skills are kind of, can be all over the place. The point that I was making kind of about the retail job versus the federal job, when you look at the average pay of one of these federal employees, plus benefits, if they were to leave that job and take one of our available retail jobs, that would be upwards of an 80% pay cut. So it's really trying to get a handle. This is all rumored, but one of the things that we have heard is that a number of cyber employees for the feds took the buyout because we've got a lot of cybersecurity jobs available. So thinking that they had a good chance of being able to move into the private sector. So getting a better handle on who's getting released, fired, and what their skill sets are, and trying to match those with the available job. And we just don't know what we don't know.
All right. Delegate Simon and then Delegate Tata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Clark, I think sort of a comment and a question. I think one of the things I've learned today through this presentation is on this probationary employees, right? There's been sort of a narrative out there that these are just new people. Like we're not really losing much experience. We're not losing a lot of talent because these are people that have only been on the job for a little while. So I think if I understand you correctly, though, there are lots of mid-level and even fairly senior people that if they've either changed jobs recently or gone to a new pay scale or gotten a step increase would be labeled probationary. And is it your experience, or are you seeing that that's in fact the case, that it's not just restricted to brand new hires, but it's probationary folks up and down the career ladder that are being let go under this probationary piece of it?
It's definitely, yes. In terms of how many and what that ratio is, I couldn't tell you. And I mean, there's obviously there's arguments to be made if you were looking to thin out the workforce. Would you go after folks who have just started that are getting paid lower amount and or have the careers ahead of them, or would you look at other folks in an organization? But the probationary employees are the easiest folks to let go the most quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, and I want to be cognizant of our time this morning, and so in the queue, I have Delegate Tata, Delegate Cole, and Delegate Watts, and then we'll wrap it up for the next speaker. Delegate Tata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. My question is on the how we prepare slide. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that there are private companies from Richmond to Baltimore that you've requested data assessing what their current needs are. I was just wondering who's collecting that data, and is there a timeline of when that is going to be due?
Sure. So that's a project being led by the Greater Washington Partnership, and I'll certainly get the committee and you the information on the director there. But they're running that effort to collect that information.
All right. Delegate Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Clark and I can certainly connect off record, but would it be possible to get the information for how many workers we have projected in the Fredericksburg, Stafford, and Spotsylvania region, because you gave some good listing for Northern Virginia. I don't want to debate the question of if I'm Northern Virginia or not, but I would like to see if we could connect off the record to get that information.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Delegate Watts.
And my question is somewhat of a follow-up on that. To the degree that you have it for SMSAs, the difference in cost of housing as percent of household income or budget, knowing how what the cost of living is in Northern Virginia that's so much higher, is this driven by cost of housing? My concern being when you lose your job, you may have mortgages, et cetera, and what we're really dealing with as far as the family budget. So if you can do that by SMSA's percentages, I would appreciate it.
Sure. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. That was a very informative presentation, and we really appreciate your work on that. Next up, we have Dr. Eric Scorsone, the Executive Director and Associate Professor for the UVA's Weldon Cooper Center. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, members of the committee. Thanks for inviting us to speak today. So I'm going to talk briefly. We have some similar information. Our numbers are a little different. We'd probably need to spend some time looking at reconciling those. I'm going to talk about reduction scenarios since we don't have firm information on the economy and state revenues. And then we are doing a quarterly economic forecast for the state. We just started. It's an interesting time to do economic forecasting. And so our first forecast is already out. It doesn't really incorporate a lot of this yet, but the next one in April will. I think one thing to point, national security is a pretty large share of Virginia's civilian workforce. We have, again, I think the numbers are right, about 180,000 federal workers, another 130,000 active duty military, but heavily engaged in national security. So that may affect how this plays out in terms of who's let go and how that affects our economy over time. As Clark said, obviously heavily located in Northern Virginia, but we have seen a lot of people moving out of Northern Virginia to do remote work. We estimate at least 25,000 since the pandemic. What happens in those situations, given the return to work orders, is unclear, but there are some parts of rural Virginia where they actually saw some significant increases in federal workforce. So we'll have to see how that plays out potentially. So we looked at a 10% reduction. The employment impact would be probably close to a negative 40,000 net job loss. To give some perspective, we are estimating about a 40,000 job gain before this started happening. So essentially, we would come close to essentially no job gains in the state in 2025. We're estimating a revenue loss, and I want to emphasize there's a lot of complexity here. People may lose a job and then they'll get a different job, and maybe that job pays more or less. So it's a very complex, moving situation. But I would say our initial estimates are $250 million of lost revenue. That would increase over time potentially, again, depending on all the dynamics. And there's a lot here, and this is something we did in the last 48 hours. So I want to emphasize it's very preliminary right now. So we looked at different scenarios in terms of the impact on the civilian employment, federal civilian employment, 1%, 5%, and 10%. So as you can see, you would have different levels of job losses in that second row. You would have losses in state gross domestic product. A 10% reduction in federal workforce would be essentially a loss of close to $6 billion in state output. And again, about a $250 million loss in state tax revenues. Now, this is assuming a lot of things right now because these models, you have to make assumptions about the world, about the macro economy and everything else. So just keep that in mind. And I didn't get a chance to talk to Claire about this. We're showing close to 475,000 residents working for the federal government. Many of them are commuting into D.C. or Maryland. Many are remote workers. So it's not just the people who work and live in Virginia. I want to emphasize the last point. A slowdown or state recessions are usually defined by a net job loss for a year. That's not really a prediction we're making. It's just a scenario right now that could happen. If it's 75%, as Clark mentioned, we'd have to run numbers on that. That's a much bigger scenario than we've looked at, honestly. So there are some real impacts. I also want to emphasize Virginia's professional services sector is one of the largest in the country, and that's heavily driven by government contracting. And so we really haven't had time to look at all the impacts on that sector, but that would also be an important multiplier effect as well, potentially. So as I said, there will be some offsets. There may be changes in other government programs. I know Joe's going to talk about aid to local governments. So there's all kinds of other things that we're not even factoring in right now that are going to take more time to understand how that could impact the Virginia economy. So looking ahead, as I said, we just started in January doing an economic forecast. We're doing that quarterly. Our first forecast was done mid-January, so before any of these things started happening. We were estimating a 40,000 net job gain for Virginia in that first forecast, and we'll be sending that out actually to all of you soon so you can take a look at it. The next forecast will be in April, and we will be estimating how this will be impacting the state forecast moving forward. It's hard to say because there's also a lot of other policy changes happening. Inflation remains stubbornly probably higher than the Fed would like, so it's likely that interest rates will remain higher, for example, than previously forecast. So I think we will see other things going on in the economy as well. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Delegate Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my request would be for the future information we receive, we could also include the 8% projected DOD reduction. The reason I say that is, some mornings I walk the bus lines that commute in from my district, and there's no less than 400 people going to the Pentagon stop just from District 21. So be very, very critical for us to know that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Delegate Wilt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm curious about your numbers. We heard the first presentation, we were somewhere 140, 160. Now we're up to 475,000. I don't know, that's a pretty good spread.
So, yeah, I think, so you think about people that live and work in Virginia for the federal government, I think we agree that's about 180,000. Then you have people that live in Virginia that work in Washington, D.C. or Maryland or remote work. So that increases the number quite a lot. And so that's where I think there's a difference of where they live versus where they work. And that's not accounting for government contractors. That's a separate category. So now our numbers are different, I will say, and Clark and I actually just met him, so we haven't had the time to talk about this. There are different data sets. I think we'd have to talk together to see how we could reconcile for you and get a firm number.
All right, thank you. Delegate Watts and then Delegate Tata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, an observation, since we rely on the individual income tax, it's where you live, which is where the state revenue issues are rather than where you work. My question had to do with local tax structure. Certainly back in 2008, one of the problems was that to balance the state budget, we cut funding to localities. So I would be very interested in who and will be doing projections for local revenue loss because of what we're looking at.
Yeah, I know Joe is going to talk about that, but we're happy to work with the Municipal League and others to try and estimate some local government impact, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, Delegate Tata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. On your economic impact, I know you said that these economic forecasts, you have to make a lot of assumptions. Do you have a way to look at some of these or many of the federal workers that also have second jobs or even third jobs and how that factors into some of your numbers?
I'd have to look. I'm not sure, honestly. That's I don't know that we have that level of detail, honestly, unless you had access to tax records. So we could take a look. But yeah, it's I think as Clark mentioned, the census, for example, gives us a certain level of detail, but honestly, there are limitations of how we can. But yeah, I'm happy to look at it for you, absolutely.
Great. Delegate Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So going back to, and I want to make sure I heard this, I don't know that I heard it correctly, so I just want some clarification, but I think I heard you say that 25% of the people that were working remotely during the pandemic left Northern Virginia. Is that what I heard?
25,000, I think
Okay.
is, yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification.
All right. I don't see any other questions in the queue. I do have a question with respect to how quickly you are able to turn numbers around and scenarios around. And so as we go out of this session and we consider what those potential impacts might be, what is your capacity with respect to running numbers and also making sure that we're on the same page in terms of what those assumptions might be?
Yeah, I'm happy to work with the staff. I'm happy to work. I mean, we can turn around in a matter of, my staff's probably not going to like what I'm going to say, but probably hours, certainly a day or two. I mean, I was chief economist of the Michigan Senate, so I know the need to do things quickly. So we stand ready to help as fast as possible. Getting on the same page with assumptions and numbers would obviously be critical. I think that's part of what, I'm happy to come to Richmond and get engaged.
Marvelous, thank you. Well, I think you are going to be an invaluable resource as we navigate through the process. So really appreciate your presentation and being here today.
Yep, thank you, appreciate it.
All right, and then next up is Mitch Mellis, the Commissioner of the Virginia Employment Commission. And so unemployment insurance is obviously a key component of what we'll be looking at. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Bulova, members of the committee. I am Mitch Mellis, Commissioner of the Virginia Employment Commission, and I do thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. In trying to stay within the tight time frame for my comments, I'm going to jump right in, just basically introducing the foundations of unemployment. UI, unemployment insurance, UI often referenced as, is a program designed to provide financial assistance on a temporary basis to workers who lose their job through no fault of their own. Individuals who quit their job without good cause or were fired for misconduct, such as falsifying information on their application, failing a drug test, or being repeatedly are examples, would be ineligible. So misconduct is typically ineligible. The program is funded solely through employer-paid taxes, not by employees. The financial assistance provided is temporary while they seek and pursue alternative work. There are generally 3 requirements for receiving UI benefits, unemployment. Monetary eligibility, how much did they make? A minimum of $3,000 in 2 of the 4 quarters to qualify. The qualification as far as were they laid off or separated, with the circumstances of the separation. Again, typically, other than misconduct, most separations are covered. Weekly eligibility, the individual would still need to be actively looking for work and must be able and available to work. Unemployment benefits are paid out of the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund here in the Commonwealth. The UI Trust Fund is administered by the VEC. It is the reserve of money set aside to pay unemployment benefits to eligible individuals who have lost their jobs. The fund is primarily financed through taxes paid by employers. The trust fund continues to maintain a healthy balance of $1.485 billion. That is on the bottom of that slide there. The fund balance factor, which is often referenced as solvency, is based on claim history, highest 3 years of history, and it is at 58%, due in part to some of the pandemic still being calculated into that solvency. However, it is in good condition, higher than pre-pandemic levels. Jumping into federal claims, I want to point out that federal claims are reimbursable employers is what they're known as, which essentially means they don't pay into the system, they reimburse the system. So if you pay out of a federal employee, the federal government will reimburse the Virginia Employment Commission's trust fund, similar how localities also are reimbursable employers. Given the federal government's frequent use of continuing resolutions, the VEC in recent years has continually maintained preparedness and awareness of the operations and uniqueness in handling unemployed federal workers. As you all are likely keenly aware, during continuing resolutions, there's oftentimes the possibility of government shutdowns and furloughs. Prior to those, we are always gearing up, adjusting resources and operations to be prepared for that. This falls very similar into that in terms of our preparation. Federal employees are generally eligible for unemployment benefits based on wages earned, requiring proof of their employment, separation documents, and wage records. Private sector workers, such as employees of federal contractors affected by federal contract disruptions, are also generally eligible for regular unemployment if the job loss was not their fault. Individuals do apply for unemployment where the work was performed, something that in recent conversations with our colleagues in DC, unemployment insurance colleagues in DC and Maryland, we are all trying to get the message very clearly out that the application for claim goes to where the work was performed. In Virginia, we have approximately 50,000 duty stations according to the federal OPM data available on FedScope. So 50,000 duty stations in Virginia. For non-DOD, approximately 160,000 if you include DOD duty stations. And for ease of use, the FedScope is a great resource that the OPM has. You can adjust data on there pretty good. As of today, I want to focus on what we do know in the actuals. As of today, we have less than 300 initial claims for unemployment insurance filed since February 1st by separated employees of a federal agency. This is an ad hoc figure for internal operations and preparations, and it is not a standardized Department of Labor report. As of the week ending February 15th, we have received approximately 70 confirmed federal unemployment claims. And these are as of the start of the new federal administration. The 72 confirmed unemployment compensation for federal employees, you all may begin to see UCFE is what it's referred to. Unemployment compensation for federal employees. This figure is part of a standard DOL report. It gets published each Thursday. As far as what we've been able to extract from government contractors, using a sample of the top 50 highest awarded companies of government contractors, for that same time period, we've received approximately 120 unemployment insurance claims from government contractors tied to the highest contracted government contractors. It's a little bit more difficult to extract that information, and as has been shared before, we're doing our best with the data that we can get access to. But that's the information we have now on current claims. The Virginia Employment Commission has and continues to remain in a state of preparedness. I think we've been in a state of preparedness in the entirety of the post-pandemic time, ready to assist individuals impacted by the current and variety of other employment transitions. We've swiftly and effectively responded in partnership with Virginia Workforce Development Agency, Virginia Works, to assist workers displaced. Incidents such as Boar's Head, Hurricane Helene in Southwest Virginia, Lawrenceville and Augusta Correctional Centers. So we've had some opportunities to really test out how we can quickly respond, adjust resources, employees, phone lines, a little bit of everything. So we feel well equipped in the current state. The Virginia Employment Commission has significantly improved our resilience and operational readiness to handle potential surges in unemployment claims. We do currently exceed workload demands. We're above the national average on our timeliness measures. We've made investments in technology, including significant use of robotic process automation, document digitization, and low-code and no-code applications. We've made an effort to streamline significantly the UI claims processing time. We now see 75 to 80% of our claims coming in online versus by phone. We've made significant strides in fraud detection. We have included measures such as a new telephony fraud detection system, ID verification through ID.me, safeguarding the system through ensuring that the claims only go to those that deserve it. We work in close collaboration with our partners at Virginia Works, ensuring laid-off workers receive rapid support and reemployment assistance. The VC is well equipped to handle claims from federal workers. As I mentioned, we leverage relationships that we have with other states to share information, attempt to get the wage data from the federal agencies, and then work on the reimbursement aspect. We recently redesigned and launched a website with a virtual assistant and enhanced user experience, including videos to ensure people have an easy understanding of the access. We see the lowest amount of help desk using the ID.me. We have the least number of people in the country attempting to use our help desk because they're not understanding ID.me. It's something like 0.7%. So we've made an effort that there's information on our website. We distribute information to all the Virginia Works partnership local offices. And so we're extremely proud that we're able to get our population onto the website with a very minimal issue. In terms of preparedness and support specific for this situation that we're here for today, we have dedicated resources for former federal employees and others. We've got a new landing page and resource guide on the VEC website. Informational video addressing federal unemployment claims. The governor's office has also launched a federal worker resource page that is up on that slide. We are in works of preparing a variety of handouts similar to other handouts that we've created through other disaster situations such as Hurricane Helene. And so we'll have handouts for our federal staff here shortly to give to all the local partnerships that we have, other state agencies. Our call center teams and staff have received specialized training already on answering some of the most commonly asked questions. We remain in close collaboration with our partners at Virginia Works. Virginia Works has developed a detailed jobs search resource on its website as well for federal workers. And certainly we encourage anyone impacted to reach out to us. Our information is up there. We've published a quick reference guide, as I mentioned, and the Virginia Works has. I encourage anyone who's a job seeker to go to that site. This coming week, Virginia Works is also launching a new simplified portal called virginiahasjobs.gov, and it's designed to be simple and easy to navigate, allowing seekers to explore job options throughout the Commonwealth. So in trying to get some figures, as I shared, it is very difficult to get some of the data that's out there. So we've attempted our best to focus on what we know. Currently, we're seeing Virginia's unemployment rate to be at 3%, which is a full percentage below the national rate. The job participation rate in the Commonwealth currently is at 66%, which is approximately 3 percentage points higher than the national average. The most recent data shows 2,899 initial unemployment claims were filed during the week ending February 15th. That's down 10% from the prior week of February 8th. The claims volume that we are seeing in January into February is very typical for post-seasonal layoffs. January typically sees about 25% higher than any other month on average of the year due to post-holiday as well as cold weather seasonal layoffs. I want to share the 253,000 open jobs recently was announced by the BLS in their JOLTS report. I would also encourage that as a resource for the committee. top occupation areas, computer mathematical occupations, healthcare practitioners are top, management occupations. The industries at the top, professional, scientific, and technical services, healthcare, and social assistance as well. Again, apologize for the data being all over the place, but when you're pulling from a bunch of different areas on a quick basis, it's a little difficult to put it all into a beautiful chart, which we would have for you guys. In closing, I'd like to say we are well prepared, as I mentioned, with our modernized unemployment systems and staffing that we have currently. Our rapid response and strong workforce partnerships that occur throughout every day with data points in real time, looking at what processing is occurring. Our phone lines is in real time on a daily basis. And we look forward to continuing to assist Virginians impacted by this to easily access the unemployment insurance benefits that we have and availed to them. So, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to share the information today and would be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Commissioner. Really appreciate your presentation. We've got a number of people in the queue. I did have a question that I wanted to ask, and it deals with probationary workers that have been let go, because in reading several of the letters, there's been vague references to underperformance or not being a good fit for the job. And I was cognizant of some of your remarks, which is that in order to be able to be eligible for unemployment insurance, it has to be not of your own fault. And so I'm curious how you all would navigate that question, right? So if you had a probationary person who was let go, for some reason, as vague as it might be, how would you handle that with respect to being able to provide unemployment insurance to that individual?
Sure, good question. Generally speaking, we're talking about misconduct being something that makes you ineligible. So, trying to find the most egregious examples just to prove a point, you punch somebody at work, you fail a drug test as a tractor trailer driver, it has to be misconduct. So poor performance does not fall in the category of misconduct.
Okay, thank you.
Thus, they would be, Mr. Chair, they would be eligible on a general scale. Of course, we have to look at the entirety. Every eligibility is an individual case, but as a whole, misconduct is what makes you ineligible.
All right, thank you for that clarification. All right, we have a whole bunch of people in the queue, so let's do this rapid fire. And so it's going to be Simons, Fagans, Thomas, Watts, Tata, Bloxham, and Kent. We'll start with Delegate Simon.
All right, I do this as rapid fire as I can. Two quick questions, though. I want to put myself in the queue twice here. But related to the chairman's question on through no fault of your own. So the fork in the road, right? These options, these buyouts and so forth. So how are we going to distinguish between a voluntary resignation if it wasn't really voluntary? I mean, so somebody says, hey, I'm going to take the buyout, I'm going to take the fork. Does that mean they're now, voluntarily unemployed, or would they be treated differently? And so how will folks know, I guess first question is, if you take the buyout, does that mean you're now ineligible? And then what resources are available for somebody to evaluate the value of the buyout versus the value of unemployment insurance? How are they going to be able to decide what the best route for them would be?
So we are the resource. So they, in terms of determining eligibility, they should reach out to us, no question. The voluntary resignation aspect, we would evaluate what documents the individual has. Part of this is simply looking at what are they provided with. I don't know for sure what 75,000 people received the same exact document. Did 10,000 receive something slightly different? I think that's where we are on that. On the voluntary resignation, if someone elected to not be there on a general sense without any other information, they would probably not qualify if they elected. However, those are handled by state, federal law, and case law as well. So every one of those will be evaluated individually with what documentation we have.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, real quick, I know there's a lot of people in the queue. So I don't know if this is much a comment or a question. I know you guys have been prepared through shutdowns, and you talked about natural disasters. It's kind of weird feeling here that we're talking about this almost like a natural disaster, although I'll save the commentary about that. But this isn't something I think that's going to be a one and done, right? I mean, I think that the realignment of the federal government and the things that we're seeing happening and the numbers that we've heard about from the two previous speakers, 9%, 75, 80,000 people, potentially coming on the rolls, and then not coming right back on. You know what I mean? It's not like they're going to be rehired in a month or a week or 6 weeks once this political situation ends, right? This is, something that seems to be a realignment. You feel confident that you guys are going to be staffed up enough, one, for the very real scale of what we're about to experience, we believe we're about to experience, and also the duration of it, right? This isn't like we're going to get this little bump in the snake and then it'll work its way out. I mean, this is a wave that's going to keep going before it ever crests. And you still feel confident that you guys can handle that?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I mean, what I'd say is we are working with the data and knowledge that we have. So we are assessed on every single morning. We literally are assessing, and that's not today. And when I mentioned hurricane and other dislocations, it's the point that we have the ability within the organization to pivot and make adjustments with cross-functional teams. People are cross-trained. The point ultimately effort of rapid response is that it is a rapid team effort that the agency looks at its operations and says, where do we need resources today? And we have that nimbleness to be able to do that. So, if you have an appeals division that happens to not have a lot of work at an onslaught of new claims, you're adjusting those appeals staff to other areas of the organization to ensure that everyone has the ability to provide the broad level of public service.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Fagans.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was in regards also to your question. It seems like it was answered in terms of for the employees that have been receiving the phrase, termination for cause. They've never received a actual evaluation. So, but the understanding is that it needs to be really egregious for them not to be eligible.
Generally, misconduct would make somebody not eligible. So if you think of standards of conduct that somebody is not permitted to do an activity. So if somebody is told, you arrived at work for the 15th time late, you were written up for that, and it's a policy of ours that says you can't do that. It's got to be a pretty tight misconduct application.
All right, thank you. Delegate Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my question is about the fund that we talked about on slide 2. Is it possible for the committee to receive projections, Commissioner, for in the 1%, 5%, and 10% reduction scenarios on that impact on the fund? The origin of my question is really from the previous presentation, we're looking at a potential 10% reduction scenario, a $6 billion loss in GDP. Obviously, that's taxes not being paid by employers since they're smaller or the employer's gone now because of these reductions, and what the impact would be on the fund. And then it would also be great to know what if you could do the 8% DOD scenario as well. Really appreciate that.
Mr. Secretary, we can work on that trust fund.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I apologize.
Delegate Watts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of follow-ups on what has already been covered. So in other words, the wording of the letter that says, based on your performance, you have not demonstrated that your further employment at the agency would be in the public interest. That is an immaterial statement, and you will look at exactly what triggered this statement. Is that what I tell the people that will be contacting me?
We will work with, so both the employer and the claimant get contacted. The performance in and of itself is not a ineligibility issue. So you are not ineligible because you were let go for poor performance.
Thank you, because that is the standard. Say, I have two other quick things.
Delegate Watts.
Reimbursement. Since the federal government then reimburses the cost of the unemployment, and we were seeing a lot of grants that have just been stopped, even though there's money outstanding balance. What will happen if the federal government stops the reimbursement that they have been doing or questions the reimbursement because of what they're saying that the performance says you're no longer needed?
I will somewhat leave that to the lawyers that we work with. A lot of that I think is a legal question. In terms of the federal government, we are not projecting the federal government not reimbursing for reimbursable employers. So simply put, the way the law is written, it's not left to the reimbursable employer to determine whether or not that person should or should not have gotten unemployment insurance. So even though an employer may disagree, the way the law is written, it is still reimbursable.
Thank you, and I want for further question, but
Delegate Watts.
I'm going to wait for the lawyers to say that, in fact, you're supposed to pay this because the state says you're supposed to. My other final question is there a cap on salary levels, given that we're dealing with some fairly high-level professionals in some of these agencies who are probationary and have been let go?
The maximum is $378 a week for a total of 26 weeks. And that's the maximum.
$78.
I do, Mr. Chair, if I may, I do want to, reference some predominantly anecdotal knowledge that we have that we have seen a lot of these individuals remain being paid. Some of the buyout, for example, there's information out there that they're paid through September. There is anecdotal information that some individuals are paid even in the probationary status. I'm not saying that we know that definitively. What I am saying is that does impact somebody applying for unemployment because severance and/or that dollar value that they're receiving would play into whether or not they get unemployment insurance because they remain getting a salary.
Thank you.
So, Commissioner, I just want to make sure I understand. So it's $378 per week, correct, is the cap? And so if you multiply that by 52, that comes out to about $20,000 annualized with respect to what you'd be able to recoup in unemployment?
It capped at 26 weeks.
Okay.
So your maximum duration is 26 weeks.
Got it. Okay. Delegate Tata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you mentioned the past shutdowns, and just for the more reassurance for us that you are ready to take this on and prepared, what have you learned from these past shutdowns that you're able to apply now? I'm sure you're always improving best practices, but what have you learned that you are getting you more prepared for what we're facing?
Sure. I would say first and foremost is cross-functionality of the staff. Not having people siloed into one skill set, that people can easily pivot and adjust between different skill sets. The ability to quickly train individuals based on outlined knowledge bases, electronic knowledge bases that somebody can quickly reference. So when you do have to train somebody quickly, you've got a knowledge base that exists, and our call center and pre-adjudication team out there has that. Robotic process automation has been a significant help. We've seen approximately 240 hours a week savings just off of a few of the bots that we're utilizing. The ability to schedule hearings, process claims. We are utilizing robotic process automation a lot more. The pandemic time period did introduce a new technology during the pandemic. The VEC went live in the midst of the pandemic, and I think that had a significant impact. So currently, our IT division getting well-trained and being able to make adjustments to our system. And again, plugging in RPA where there are manual processes so that people can focus on the customer service rather than the manuality of the job.
All right. Thank you. Delegate Bloxham, and then we'll wrap it up with Delegate Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A comment and a question, too. As someone who pays tax into the trust fund, and I am very judicious on when I let someone go to make sure that I don't get penalized because they will increase my payment to the trust fund on an annual basis. So every time you let someone go, it needs to be for good cause, and those cases are adjudicated. And if the employee wants to fight it because he left and he does not believe for good cause, then we have a case that is adjudicated. And I will say that the VEC is makes the employer prove that it was for good cause that I let the employee go. The employee is well protected in this system. And my question is kind of following up. Have there been cases that you know of that a locality, because localities, state government, federal government, local governments do not have to pay into the trust fund, but they reimburse the trust fund if there's an unemployment claim? Has there been a government that actually said, we do not want to pay, and what was the course of action on that?
So if a government entity elects not to pay, we of course engage first and foremost to figure out why. We will educate on what a reimbursable employer is and as it's outlined in the law as a reimbursable employer. And if a state or local government would not want to reimburse, we would go through the collection procedure as we would as the Department of Taxation or anybody else would.
All right, Delegate Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up on some of your comments, I've seen this perspective of unemployment from the employer side, but I wanted to understand if I was the worker and filed a claim, what does that time frame really look like?
So I'm going to divide those into two categories. If you are a regular worker who we have your wages for, which is everyone except a federal worker, you know, we get those average above 80% within 21 days, you get your payment. If you are a federal worker, we don't have a great answer for that at the moment because we don't have wages on federal workers. So we are working to find streamlined avenues of getting that information in cooperation with our partners in DC and Maryland. How can we get wage data as fast as we can from federal agencies?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, Delegate Wilt is going to slip one last quick question in. Delegate Wilt.
Thank you for indulgence, Mr. Chairman. And going back to Delegate Watts' question, so that's a thing I think is on all of our minds. Are there situations, are there localities that don't pay, that
Yes.
haven't ponied up? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
Yes, there are localities that elect not to pay and that we've gone in and done liens through the law of Virginia that says we can put a lien on a state or local government.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you all three of our presenters. That was invaluable information, and we're going to be leaning in on each and every one of you as we continue through the process. Want to transition to our next agenda items, and so we do have some presentations that are going to focus on how federal spending affects state and local government budgets. And so again, as I started off, we're going to be adopting our budget later on today, but obviously we as a state rely on our federal partners for funding in a number of key areas. So we're going to start off with Kim McKay, supported by David Reynolds, to talk about the state budget, and then we're going to turn it over to Joe Flores, who's the Director of Fiscal Policy for the Virginia Municipal League, to talk about the local perspective. So thank you so much, Kim.
All right, thank you. As you said, Mr. Chair, the next portion of our agenda is designed to help provide a sense of scope and scale of federal spending in the state from the perspective of state and local budgets. And we'll also, in this presentation, touch on a little bit about the direct payments Virginians receive from the federal government, as well as businesses through contracting. I'll qualify our remarks that additional analysis is needed over the next several months to truly understand the challenges reductions in federal spending can cause for the state government services, as well as for our workforce, as Clark mentioned earlier. But this is just an initial presentation designed to give you a sense of the scale. Just as a refresher for many of you, the state receives money through two funds, the general fund and the non-general fund. The general fund includes income taxes, sales taxes, and corporate taxes collected by the state and can be used for any purpose directed by the General Assembly. The non-general fund includes revenues that come to our state for specific purposes, and they generally come with rules related to the use of those funds. And this consists of federal funding, tuition and fees for higher education, as well as gas taxes. Some early analysis of FY24 spending data from Cardinal, which is the state's accounting system, shows that about 1/3 of state spending is supported by federal funding. 95% of the spending, the $23.7 billion included on this side, occurs through two secretariats, the Secretary of Education and the Secretary of Health and Human Resources. About $17 billion of the federal funding comes from state expenditures in agencies that fall into the HHR Secretariat, and about $4 billion flows through the Education Secretariat to both support secondary and post-secondary education in the state of Virginia. While HHR and education account for the largest share of federal funds, agencies within each secretariat rely on federal funds to deliver core programs and services. About half of all spending from agencies in the Veterans and Defense Affairs Secretariat is supported by federal funds. Much of the support goes to help veterans access health services through the state's veteran care centers. In the Commerce and Trade Secretariat, federal funds are expended to provide housing-related services, for example. It isn't surprising on this next slide that Medicaid dominates federal spending at the state level with $14.6 billion in expenditures to provide health care coverage for Virginians. In the areas of direct aid to public education, these pass-through funds that occur through the state budget consist primarily of Title I funding to assist school divisions with high share of children from low-income families. And they also provide services for special education programming and support school nutrition programs. Before we leave this slide, I'll note that the social service spending includes SNAP benefits, which Clark mentioned earlier. Those are direct payments to individuals, and SNAP accounts for about $1.5 to $2 billion of annual spending in the state. Virginia, as you all know, ranks as the highest state for federal contract spending every year since I've been in state government. There's been about $110 billion spent in the state through the federal procurement process, and that was for federal fiscal year 2024. Other speakers have also talked about the localities that will be most directly impacted by a federal workforce reduction. But the box on this slide, the green box in this slide, shows the federal procurement spending by localities and the top recipients of companies in those communities. And then it also reinforces that the largest impact in any reduction in federal contracting will be felt in Northern Virginia as well as the Hampton Roads regions. The blue box on this slide shows federal direct payments to individuals. The Veterans Affairs spending that's included on this slide includes veterans' pensions and retirement plans, as well as education assistance. The education spending accounted for this slide, the about $1 billion coming through the Department of Ed. That includes Pell Grants to low-income post-secondary students in the Commonwealth. So to wrap up this portion of the presentation, this is a preliminary assessment and reconfirms Virginia's state budget relies on federal spending to provide core services to its citizens. We'll need to dive deeper into the state's accounting system over the coming months to get a more complete picture of any impact of reduced federal spending on the state budget and likely its workforce. Additionally, state general fund dollars cannot backfill reduced federal spending for large programs like at Medicaid. There's just very much difficulty backfilling $14 billion of federal support with our state general fund dollars. It will be critical as we monitor the situation over the coming months through this committee to prioritize the things we can do from a financial perspective. And finally, any contraction of federal spending on the individual payment side and the procurement side will likely have an impact on state general fund revenues due to our reliance on personal income and sales taxes. That completes the financial portion, but at the request of our chair, he asked us to cover some of the initial General Assembly response to the current situation, and most of which is contained in the Appropriations Act that will be before y'all later today. So there are a couple of provisions included in the appropriations bill. They are included in Part 4 of the budget. One language amendment to the budget requires the Department of Tax to estimate impacts to the state general fund as a result of federal tax law changes, and further requires the General Assembly to address any shortfall that exceeds $100 million. So if there are federal tax changes and tax says, hey, it is going to decline general state tax collections by $100 million, it requires a budget bill to come down to the General Assembly to address that issue. Comparatively, on the grant side of the equation, there's a Part 4 amendment that includes similar provisions for declining federal grant support that exceeds $100 million and requires the General Assembly take action to address that challenge as well. Additionally, the budget freezes rolling conformity with federal tax law for 2 years to prevent any changes to federal tax policy from having a significant impact on general fund revenue tax collections. There's also been some bills that have moved through the legislative process this year that will help address the situation. So Senate Bill 1430 increases the stay on foreclosure proceedings from 30 to 60 days for homeowners and tenants impacted by federal closures and furloughs. Additionally, there's Senate Bill 1472, and that allows the combined balances of both the state's Revenue Stabilization Fund and Revenue Reserve Fund to exceed the 15% cap on general fund collections. So this bill really essentially allows the General Assembly to set aside more resources to help mitigate the budgetary impact of reduced federal spending. At the end of the biennium, both of these funds are projected to have just over $4 billion set aside in them. And then finally, later on today, the General Assembly will take steps to ensure it can enter into a special session to quickly address any impacts resulting from federal changes. So that completes the presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Kim. And I know in putting this together, this is preliminary, and you all have also the responsibility of putting together the budget that we had today. If anybody has any very general questions, now would be the time, but we're going to be gentle because this is all moving quickly, and again, pulling together data that we hope was helpful for the committee. Delegate Watts.
So I think this is under the category of general. I would also add to the action that you took that you are looking at the CITES issue of how we collect. When I look at slide 6, and we are looking at top Virginia recipients of federal contracts, if we move to solely CITES of where the service is delivered as opposed to payroll or presence, what will that do as far as what our revenue actually will be set aside, everything else that is happening. But I also must observe, having been involved in the 2017 tax reform that took place on the federal government, that when I looked at the wording of within 30 days of any tax change, you are to come up with an estimate of what that's going to mean. What we found in the last round is it took months and months for IRS to make various policy statements interpreting the language of what Congress had passed as to what it actually meant in our tax structure. So it was literally months later and a significant study before we could interpret what happened in December. That report didn't come out until August or September, and then we weren't able to act on it until the following year. So not critically at all, just the reality of the last round that we had of tax cut changes.
Right. Thank you. Delegate Simon.
So this maybe I could have saved for the round robin, but I'll ask it since you're here now. When I worked in local government, I was in Fairfax County when we had a massive change in how we did budgeting, and we always had a shortcut at local government. Like whatever cut you were making is how many pennies is that on the tax rate, right? Mm-hmm. We can either take the money away, the spending away, or we can make up for it with revenue. Is there a metric, like if we had to come up with $1 billion, well, our whole rainy day fund is $4 billion, and Medicaid's 15 for just 1 year. But is there some maybe for a future meeting, some sort of what is the impact on the tax rate? What would the state income tax rate have to be, to to make up for some of the revenue that's lost? I'm just curious, about some of the revenue side pieces of that.
Right. That's a great question. I think that's something that we need to dive into as we kind of continue on our work of what an increase in the sales tax, for example, could generate in terms of revenue that could backfill any potential loss of federal grant funding. But I can't opine on what that would be at this moment.
I didn't expect you to be able to do it just now, Mr. Chairman. But again, like I said, maybe something for the future, because there's a lot of talk about devolving some of this stuff. Again, this is sort of the permanent nature of these changes, potentially permanent nature. There's a lot of talk about devolving this stuff. So what's it going to cost if we have to pick up some of these things permanently?
Yes, I think that's one of the scenarios that we can kind of work with our colleagues moving forward to kind of say, if we increase this tax by X dollars, this is how much it will generate, and this is where it could be spent to backfill potential federal losses. That's something we can run when we have a little bit more time.
All right, very good. Last comment from Delegate Wilt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm thinking, what we're looking at here, the fiscal impact of the state. How did the state respond? You don't look old enough to, that's a compliment. So back in the state, when we dealt with NAFTA and that kind of, that's a huge impact to the state. How did we navigate that?
Delegate Wilt, what I'll say is we've kind of talked internally as a staff about some of the response, how we navigated the Great Recession in 2008. And what happened is we took action in the budget to reduce spending in one single amendment that was very long, but it basically reduced spending across every program, every secretariat in state government. So it was essentially gutting core services to be able to mitigate the impacts of the Great Recession.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you very much, David, for that really great presentation. And next we've got Joe Flores with the Virginia Municipal League. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was kind of hoping that you would ask the committee to be gentle with me too, since I was, spent some time as a former staffer to Senate Finance and briefly with House Appropriations as well. But
we'll see
I'll have to
based on
take
your
my
presentation.
chances with the committee. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the members for reaching out to VML and asking us to give the perspective of local governments on this issue. I have to tell you that there is a palpable sense of anxiety amongst local government officials about what the impacts are. And part of it is just the unknown, the uncertainty. And you've heard that today, the lack of clear and concise information. We don't know what we're shooting at in terms of trying to set our budgets. And I'll touch on that. Let's see if I can. Thank you. So, it seems like every day there's an announcement by the new administration regarding unprecedented federal funding decisions and possible personnel actions, and you've certainly heard that today, and that's overwhelming local government officials. One locality tells us that they've received conflicting reports and guidance from federal agencies, and they've been waiting for things to settle down before we can even begin our economic analysis. Federal guidance on the funding freeze that was rolled out earlier this month and personnel actions have been unclear, contradictory, and confusing, again, making it difficult to begin to assess what the situation is. One locality tells us that the length of the freeze has been unclear, and even though the freeze may have been lifted, we're still hearing stories and anecdotes from localities that they're being told that funding is being withheld. So it makes it challenging for us. As soon as we heard about the funding freeze that had come down and other federal funding reductions, we reached out to our partners with the National League of Cities, but also with the National Conference of State Legislatures, just trying to understand the landscape. And everybody is scrambling, just like we are, to assess the landscape that we're dealing with. And I got to tell you that details about the federal grants that are affected, again, to allow us to respond, are really hard to find. And so that's something that would be helpful going forward. Something that I wanted to share with you is that we looked at how much funding localities receive from the federal government for our operations. It's about 10 cents, so 10 cents on the dollar. You see, and this was alluded to earlier, I think, by Kim, some of that is federal pass-through monies. It's about $3 billion in fiscal year 2023, and that's the most recent data that we have. That goes through VDOT, it goes through the Department of Social Services and other state agencies, so it should be easier to track in terms of the impact to localities. There's also direct federal aid that goes directly to localities, cities, towns, and counties. That's about $1.4 billion. So again, you see, on average, it's about 10% of our revenues. It varies a little bit by cities and towns. But some of our localities are more reliant upon federal funding. What you see here is that 2 localities, federal funding makes up more than 30% of their revenues. At least it did in fiscal year 2023. And 10 localities, it makes up more than 20% of their revenues. That makes them more vulnerable as decisions are made about reducing or eliminating federal grants. I would also share with you, and Kim touched on this a little bit, some of our state agencies are even more vulnerable than this. The health department, 42% of their revenues are accounted for by federal funds. 42% of the health department's revenues come from federal grants. I was surprised because I looked this morning, DSS federal funding accounts for 45%. I thought that the health department was the most exposed. It's actually within the HHR Secretariat, not including Medicaid or medical assistance services, it's social services. You've heard this earlier, so I'm just going to skip over this a little bit, but Northern Virginia is certainly more vulnerable in terms of job losses, partly because it's proximity to D.C., and so they're subject to job losses and potential economic disruption up there. The Northern Virginia Regional Commission indicates or estimates that 16% of the workforce in the 8th Congressional District is made up of federal employees. Fairfax tells us that about 80,000 of their federal workers reside in the county. Economists tell us that, and this was alluded to earlier, I believe, maybe by Clark, that the loss of one federal employee has a multiplier effect. So you're going to lose potentially another employee or maybe 2 employees. So if you lose 1,000 jobs, you're probably talking 2,000 or 2,500 that could be affected. So that's something to be mindful of and watch going forward. The potential impact is not confined to wages either. There will be ripple effects for localities, sales tax revenues, property tax revenues, and meals tax. So it does have, a negative multiplier effect. Hampton Roads also has a lot of employees, a lot of federal institutions, so they are in the crosshairs here if federal funding is reduced. About 60,000 federal employees are estimated to work in the Hampton Roads region. And Portsmouth has a number of institutions in their area, 14,000 employees. You've got the shipyard and the medical center, and the economic impact could be in the $1.1 billion area. Hampton, across the water, is also home to a number of large institutions, Langley Air Force Base, NASA Langley Research Center, the VA, and Fort Monroe, but also some major industries, the Port of Virginia, the shipyard, and other federal institutions as well. Federal budget cuts or slowdowns to the port will have a ripple effect for the economy of Virginia. So some of the consequences that we're seeing at the local level, we're in the process right now of putting together our budgets, and we are very thankful that today you guys will vote a state budget so that we can eliminate some of that uncertainty going forward. So thank you very much for that. But there are questions about what's coming down at the federal level, and I alluded to this earlier. We've got a moving target here in terms of what the feds are going to provide. And so we are trying to assess and will be assessing what the direct and indirect economic impact of some of the changes coming down are. Can we afford at the local level to backfill some of the reductions that may come down? How many employees are we talking about, and what resources do they have, maybe through VEC or other entities, to assist them in a transition, and hopefully they stay? And then what's the impact on state and local revenues, and that's been alluded to earlier, and that's something that we're going to have to work on going forward. Localities, I mentioned earlier this palpable sense of anxiety. What I heard from one locality is that the uncertainty is making it difficult for us to establish our budgets, and so we're even more cautious than in years past. You see that in the Richmond area, one locality told us that their finance folks have shared that they're bracing for what they believe might be a bigger impact in this cloud of chaos, their words, and threatening economic conditions. I think it just alludes to the fact that you've got the funding freeze, you've got potential layoffs, and then you've got the House and Senate setting their budget resolutions at the federal level, which will have ripple effects for the Commonwealth and for localities. So my former boss, Betsy Daly, with Senate Finance, used to tell me also, Joe, don't just come to me with problems. Try and give me some things that I can work on or solutions. So I tried to do that today, Mr. Chairman and members. One is specific information and details will really be helpful for us. So there will be challenges to the administration's authority to withhold previously appropriated funds. That's going to wind its way through the courts. And in the meantime, it would really be helpful if the federal government indicates to us what grants are we talking about, how much, if they're frozen, how do we unfreeze them? One locality tells us that they were told that even though the federal grant was awarded to the town, that funding reimbursements were being withheld. We have heard this on a number of occasions, and we have to follow up with them time after time. And they can't finish the project. They will not be able to finish the project without these federal dollars. This is a small town. In the meantime, in terms of your work and our work as well, the Department of Planning and Budget has to program their systems to account for all of the federal grants that come through the Treasury. So it would be really helpful if they could create a baseline for us going forward that we can compare to future reductions potentially in funding, which will inform your decisions and our decisions about what to do going forward. We should look at grants that have been awarded through September 30th of 2024. So again, to get a baseline and then compare that to any proposed changes that may come down the line. Again, to inform your decisions and ours as well. In terms of personnel actions, and this was alluded to earlier with from VEC, timely access to unemployment data is critical. During the pandemic, VEC was able to reduce the time frame and distribute information to localities so that we could prepare a response for our constituents. That would be really helpful going forward because otherwise the lag in data collection, you're talking 1, 2, sometimes 2.5 months. And so if we can reduce that, I think that would be extremely helpful. Mr. Chairman, just to wrap things up for you guys, there are unprecedented federal funding decisions and potential layoffs that are coming down that will be disruptive not just to the local economies but the Commonwealth as well. We need clear and concise information to the extent possible so that we can figure out how to plan, how to respond. I can't remember, I think you, Mr. Chairman, mentioned the planning aspect of this whole exercise. And then finally, federal grantees are delivering services in our communities every day, but also families are affected by layoffs, not just the employee, but extended families as well. So we owe it to them to get as much information as we can, again, to prepare a response at the local level and the Commonwealth to assist our constituents. So I'd be happy to provide answer any questions if they're gentle, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Joe. And I think in particular, you know, when you look at the overall impacts, they're big, but I think the percent of funding that's relied upon by some of our smaller towns and cities, I think is a real wake-up call. Delegate Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On that note, if we can go back to slide 4, those figures are absolutely striking. I was wondering if we could hear some examples of what types of federal grants or funding that those figures represent to kind of educate us as we move forward. I appreciate that.
Mr. Chairman and Delegate Thomas, I think great minds think alike. I had the same question. Unfortunately, the Auditor of Public Accounts doesn't collect the information that granularly. There is, depending upon the threshold at which we're talking about, if it's over, I believe, $750,000, an audit report has to be submitted to the feds, which will allow us to get to that level of detail. Where we can, and I know that I think the committee is going to meet more than one time this year, that'll be my next project, is try and shed some more light on that, because I think that's important.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? All right, seeing none, we got our work cut out for us, but thank you so much for being here with us.
Sir, thank you.
2 other quick things. The first one, I wanted to talk a little bit about future meetings and locations, and so as Mr. Flores went ahead and alluded to, we are going to meet several times. Right now, we're anticipating 4 meetings to accomplish our work. And we would like to be able to hold those meetings in different parts of the Commonwealth so that we're getting different views and perspectives on our work and what it is that we need to be able to do with respect to our families and our budget. With realizing that things can change, we anticipate that the first meeting will be up in Northern Virginia, probably Arlington. Then we'll go down to the Hampton Roads area. We'll also like to have a meeting address rural issues, and so something out in the western part of Virginia, and then we'll move things back over here to Richmond. This isn't going to be spread out all the way through the year, because I think we need to collect this data and make sure that we're ahead of the decision making. And so we'll get out to you as soon as possible with dates and locations. And if anybody has suggestions for where we can meet in Arlington or Hampton Roads or out in West Virginia, please let us know so that we can go ahead and plan accordingly. The last thing,
Falls Church City has some wonderful.
Falls Church City, yes, I know. The last thing I want to do, and quite honestly, this is really important. I think we've heard a lot of really good data. We know that we have some challenges ahead. But again, as I mentioned earlier, the people who are on this committee were selected for a reason, because you do provide different perspectives and backgrounds, and are going to be a key part of helping to make sure that we plan accordingly. And so wanted to save the next 15 minutes for a member roundtable. And really, if I could ask each member to weigh in on 3 different questions or one of the 3. So, what are your expectations for the committee? What do we want to be able to get out of this? Who should we hear from? We've had some fantastic presenters today, but there's a number of other organizations that could also provide some very valuable information. And so we want to make sure that we're hearing from a large range of voices. And then the last one is, what additional information do we need to hear in order to be able to make informed recommendations? Again, the House of Delegates, the General Assembly, our constituents are relying on us to be able to collect the data and then not just hear it, but come back with recommendations for how to act on that data. So I think I saw Delegate Campbell lighten up. Did I? No? Anyways, I will start picking on people if you don't go ahead and hit your speak lights.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Delegate Campbell.
That was not my light, but thank
There we
you.
go.
So I just think that it's important for us to continue to receive the live numbers of who this impacts. The information that we received today about the 300 potential people that this has already impacted, I think that's important. I do want to say that I think that the fact that we are all here and trying to get ahead of this is really important as well. But, again, I think it's really critical that we get live data very quickly so that we know where we need to put the most effort forward.
Great. Thank you, Delegate Campbell. Delegate Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm very appreciative of this committee. There are a lot of folks that are hurting right now and a lot of families that are nervous about what's about to happen, and I think it's very important that the committee gets its work right and gets it out as soon as possible to provide relief and then taking legislative action that's necessary. To that end, Mr. Chairman, perhaps it's the lawyerly mind, but I do have a few bullet points I will quickly go through. I think the first one is a global question, Mr. Chairman. I do think it's actually quite important that today, or at least before the next meeting, we establish a set of scenarios that we want to see from all presenters, so we're doing apples-to-apples comparisons. I did like the approach of 1%, 5%, and 10% reduction scenarios with an 8% DOD reduction, but defer to the chair's prerogative on what we would like to see from everyone to maintain consistency. That said, people I'd like to hear from, particularly interested in the housing and real estate space, what those reductions would look like, in office and retail space, housing, and then also the larger implications for the mortgage industry. I don't think it's lost on anyone that a couple economic calamities ago, massive foreclosures that ended up destabilizing the global economy. We have a lot of expensive homes in Northern Virginia and Virginia in general, and what that would impact the economy as well. I'd like to see modeling on what happened from localities and how they dealt with the Great Recession and COVID when it came to massive layoffs. Local transit authorities would also like to see what their projected impacts from a 1%, 5%, or 10% would be. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, it'd be great to get presentations from those groups that were on, I forget the slide, but the largest recipients of federal funding. My mind particularly goes to the Department of Veteran Services here in Virginia. And on that note, it would be great to hear from folks about the healthcare system, particularly with veterans healthcare. If that healthcare system degrades significantly due to funding cuts and staffing cuts, will we see a migration of patients into the private system, and is our private system prepared to provide the relief to our vulnerable veterans? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, gold star for Delegate Thomas. Well done. Delegate Fagans.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Right now, when we look on Virginia jobs.virginia.gov, there are about 4,734 jobs listed, which means that but we're having thousands of individuals, public servants, being fired right now. I'd like for us to be able to look at, what can we use with the tools we have available right now, to speed up the hiring process for these public servants. We have to come up with, really creative solutions to try to solve an unprecedented issue. We need to look at, significantly, potentially, reducing the hiring process for these, our state agencies, from months to weeks to days. For those that are suitably qualified, fast tracking these public servants. We have constituents right now, they're hurting. They're scared, and they've lost their job to no fault of their own. I know at the end of this year, we're going to offer a lot of great recommendations, but between now and then, I'd love for our committee to be working, weekly on trying to figure out ways to stabilize these public servants who have dedicated, weeks, months, years of their lives, to taking care of serving our country, of serving our community. And they're scared about how they're going to pay their mortgage, how they're going to pay their rent, how they're going to take care of their families. And we need to be looking at everything we can do to stabilize their life, because everything right now seems to be in chaos in their lives. And I know that this committee is going to be making sure that we can provide some stability to their life.
All right, thank you very much, Delegate Fagans. Delegate Watts.
The excellent statements that preceded me, I'd like to hit two aspects. One, first, my legislative responsibilities as far as taxes. I am glad that we got into it to the degree that we did today, because everything that I read in the national press and listen to, the two things are together. The workforce cuts so that we can afford to make massive tax changes, and since we are a conformity state, those will directly ripple into Virginia. So I believe we need to keep abreast of these things extremely closely as they move together. But now, putting on my other hat, I pretty should have introduced myself as a member of a federal employee family for my entire marriage, so that when I hear the comments, as I have just heard, about the concerns about insecurity, I can assure you that it is not just financial insecurity that we are dealing with. And that the issues that I am particularly concerned about is that right on the heels of the insecurity of COVID and what that did to our lives, and as well as what we have seen in the response of the military to the way in which we have done deployments, so that I won't go into all of the issues that are involved, but the very high incident of suicide within the military that has grown over the last decade plus, and our ever greater awareness, fortunately, of some of the mental health issues that I am touching on in what I refer to both for the military, for COVID, and in our schools. That while this is not a time when we're going to be able to afford new programs, and we have a great need for the services to be provided by professionals, I would be remiss if I didn't underscore that as being one of the major challenges that we have for the families and individuals within Virginia that we will have to be dealing with.
All right, thank you very much, Delegate Watts. Delegate Anthony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All of the presentations have really lighted the fire here, and certainly this committee, as well as the General Assembly, has a tremendous workload in mitigating all of these challenges. And in addition to all of the information that we've been presented, being someone, I'm a former civil servant and a former defense contractor, certainly know the impact that it has on certain regions within the Commonwealth. But I'm particularly looking at what is the impact on public education, looking at, Title I funding, of course, the impact on schools that are serving our military families, all things where there's a high concentration of federal workers that might see declining enrollment within certain schools. Also looking at higher education, especially with our land grant institutions, with agricultural research funding freezes. What is the STEM research grants that are at risk? What are the climate research initiatives? What has been stalled already? What is the impact of student aid and work study programs as well, and veterans who are using GI benefits? What could they, face service delays? Also federal work study positions, and what is that going to do for our higher ed institutions? And of course, I would like to hop on what Delegate Thomas said, especially our transit authorities. I'm looking at the larger transportation projects, particularly with, port improvements, looking at high-speed rail. Would like to see some, what are those impacts with those particular agencies, as well as what is going to happen with Virginia Economic Development, with our small businesses that depend on that for, those federal workforce dollars in and around, critical infrastructure sites. What is the impact all the way granular to small businesses? So we do have our work cut out for us.
Thank you so much, Delegate Anthony. Delegate Tata.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I want to start with what we've sort of been said, the better data. I mean, we've had some of the experts in the room, and even they don't really agree on the numbers or don't know the numbers. So we really don't know exactly what we're dealing with, and so we're going to have better data. And I know that's going to be coming. I do like the modeling scenarios because that does offer some different scenarios. But it would be nice to have sort of a point person or, on some of these websites, a place where people can go for up-to-date information. So, because, we're hearing things all over the place. So it would be nice to have sort of a more consolidated place to get information. And I really want to hear from the people that have jobs, like CEOs and company agency people that have these openings to come and talk to us and maybe, have portals on their websites to give preferential treatment to those coming from the federal, federal employees who have lost their job, maybe offer bonuses to hire those, incentivize them to actually hire, to kind of, bring people together, the people that have the jobs for the people that need the jobs. So that's what I would like to see on this.
Thank you very much, Delegate Tata. Delegate Simon.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. As far as my expectations of this committee, I hope that we do more than just work on defining the problem. And I think it's important that we do that. I think that's important work, that we kind of find out what the scope of this is, get the data. And again, I think that the numbers guys can put their heads together and agree, to pick the same data sets to work from, so we can all work from a same sheet of music or whatever, play the same tune. But that's just part of it, right? I think. And the reason I asked for some of the data about what the cost would be to backfill it, I mean, beyond just defining the problem, I think people expect us to come up with some potential solutions or at least some policy options to recommend to the General Assembly. So, saying, hey, look, this is a big, scary problem tells us, part of the story. What's the rest of the story, which is what does that mean for us and how do we solve that? And again, what are the policy options to do it? I'm reminded of, you talked about what we did during the Great Recession. We did an across-the-board cut. There's another alternative, too, which is to decide what lines of business does the state government want to stop being in, right? We did a lines of business review, again, when Fairfax in 1997 had their big Great Recession, the pre-Great Recession, and said, all right, well, what are we going to stop doing for people now if we don't have the money to do it anymore, versus just a blanket across the board. We'll just do everything we do poorly, or do we pick the things that we do and do them better? Versus, again, backfilling the revenues from other state sources, if this is part of a larger movement to change the relationship between state and local and the federal government. And if that's something that's going to persist, then we need to define what that relationship would look like. And again, give us some policy options for how we pay for all that. So those are some of the things I'd like to see, and I expect us to do. And again, I think our constituents expect, again, not just to tell them how bad things are, but to tell them, what does the future look like? And I think we've heard a lot about the anxiety, and I've heard a lot from some very anxious constituents. And I think a lot of that anxiety is driven just because, for the last 60, 70 years, you sort of knew you followed the rules, you did what you were supposed to do, and you had a very predictable path through the future. And the future, I think, looks very uncertain to people looking forward. So we need to give them some idea of what the future might look like. I think that'll help a lot with some of the anxiety. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oh, and lastly, which sectors are being hit hardest too? I mean, we heard about job losses. So far, again, we've got fairly gross numbers, but as we get down, I'd love to hear, like I said, Delegate Tate's a great idea. Let's hear from some CEOs, but some of our biggest employers, private employers in Virginia that may have job openings now, those job openings may disappear if they're not able to contract for building more defense systems, or they're not providing cybersecurity anymore. So which sectors are likely to be hit in the private sector piece of it? So I'd like to get some more information on that as we go forward.
Great. Thank you, Delegate Simon. And I think those are very astute observations. And I think that gets to the core of our mission, which is not just to collect data, but also come up with tangible recommendations for what we as a Commonwealth can do. And I think what we'll ask is that when we have presenters come in and give us data and information, that they always have to end with a slide or two that speaks to what kind of solutions would they propose that we would adopt to protect Virginia's family and economy. Delegate Cole and then Delegate Wilt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to serve on this very important endeavor to see what we can do to protect Virginians. I think it's also very key. I think I'm the only one up here that represents the 7th Congressional District, and what is very interesting is a recent report came out that said the 7th Congressional District had the highest concentration of federal workers out of any other congressional district in the entire United States. And so I'm very much interested to hear, we've heard Delegate Thomas talk about housing, and I remember being here in 2020 when we had to deal with the pandemic. The difference between then and now is we had extra money coming in. We're not going to have extra money coming in. We're actually going to be losing money over this situation. And I'm very much interested in how the loss of that money, of federal income, is going to impact our communities. I also noted that Spotsylvania County, where I represent, is in the top 5 counties that receives federal funding. We are about to attend a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a brand-new VA hospital next week, and how these cuts are going to impact our veterans. And Mr. Chair, I must say that I have seen so many different people on social media rather excited about these cuts, rather excited about these job losses. And that reminds me of a quote from a long time ago that said, at first, they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't Jewish. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then when they came for me, there was no one to speak up because everyone had been taken. And so I think what's very interesting is that these job cuts and these cuts are not just impacting people with federal jobs, but all across the board, people are going to be feeling the hurt. And we have to make sure we're doing what we can within the power that we have to do that. And I also think, Mr. Chair, I heard my venerable colleague from Virginia Beach say that she would love to hear from CEOs and different people who are offering jobs. I think that's key. But I think we also need to hear from these people who are going to be impacted. These people who are being laid off, these people who are on probationary status, who don't know what's going to happen next week, a month from now, 2 months from now, and maybe we just need to offer them an opportunity to have their voice heard. And so I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Delegate Cole. Delegate Wilt, then Delegate Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. So it's probably quite glaring to everyone in this room that we don't know what we don't know. Okay, so testimonies that we've heard today, I mean, it's just full of assuming or estimating, likely, I think, lack of clarity, the unknown. And that's why we're here, Mr. Chairman. We've been assigned this task. And to me, it's twofold, although I don't know that it was explicitly spelled out in the Speaker's directive, but the Speaker directed us to look at the physical impact to the state of Virginia of what's potentially going on. And I'll use that word again, potentially. I mean, it's all in flux. We know that. Just to sit here, some of the information was asked for. We need this. Where are we going to get that information? But again, it's all in flux, and I get that. I mean, it's creating uncertainty for a lot of people. But I think it's important that we avoid theatrics trying to say things that aren't there and using it for, I don't know, whatever, campaign speeches or whatever. But we stick to the facts. We've got some good resources here. We're at a good presentation for the Virginia Employment Commission. I think they're very capable of updating us as needed. Department of Tax, and then as it goes into appropriations, what the impact is going to truly be. We've heard it take months and months. We need to continue to work, but I think we need to really stay focused on the task at hand, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Delegate Wilt. Delegate Kent, and then we'll wrap it up with Delegate Blocks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My dear colleague forgot about me. Just south of Fredericksburg. I'm Congressional 7 too. I just wanted to say I appreciate so much of what Delegate Tata and Delegate Simon said, because I was thinking about Mr. Mercer's remarks, and I appreciate those in just our public-private sector partnership and really what does that look like and what is the skill set that we're looking at and how do they coordinate or not. But I just kind of wanted to wave the flag a little bit for rural Virginia, because I know post-COVID we saw a lot of influx of folks. And that was unique to rural versus urban. And so I just would love to, as we're kind of looking at expectations and who we want to hear from, just kind of highlight that and what does that look like with our Department of Agriculture, USDA, and those folks that are affected in kind of the rural ripple effect of maybe an influx of population and how does that look on our infrastructure. So thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Delegate Kent. Delegate Blocks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to close up with you. A couple different things that I think we're going to need the different scenarios, low, middle, high. I think that's very important. The jobs that are available, I mean, what I saw from the Rural Caucus, I think the number was like 240,000. My colleague said 4,000. There's a wealth of, wide range difference there. I think we need to try to figure out and match up. And I think VEC is very capable of doing that, matching up where the jobs are and try to fill it. And Mr. Chairman, I will say this, having the pleasure of serving on the HHR subcommittee for the last conference committee for the last 4 years. A lot of those formulas are set. It's 22% of our budget, I think, is the number now. If the federal government changes the rules, then we will have to adjust if you accept those rules. And those are kind of set. So, we will, all this is in flux. We don't know if they just cut funding across the board or if they're going to change the rules or if they're going to change the application. We really just don't know yet. So, I appreciate this opportunity, Mr. Chairman. I think we'll try to do what the Speaker wants and, try to make sure that we take care of our Virginians. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. Again, I want to just thank this committee for a really robust conversation over the last 2 hours. I want to thank all of our presenters for stepping up to the plate and providing data as it is in real time, and I think it was mentioned, it continues to shift and change, and it will be really incumbent upon us to make sure that we are bringing in that data and better understanding exactly how that is going to affect local governments, our state government, as well as families as they navigate these particular changes. And then again, just want to repeat what Delegate Simon said is, our core purpose, our core mission is to take in that data and then to be able to provide recommendations out so that we can react and respond on the best interests of the Commonwealth. So a lot of work ahead of us, but couldn't be more proud to have a committee that is willing to roll up their sleeves and dig into the details and then come back out with an action plan for where to go next. Any other items for the good of the order? With that, do we have a motion to adjourn? All right, so all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. We are adjourned. Thank you, committee.